3 years ago, I was married off to the man who killed my father. They called me a war trophy. I let them believe it, because none of them knew that an Omega's scent could kill too slow, gentle, and leaving no trace behind. This isn't a story about a victim who learned to survive. This is a story about how I burned an entire empire down from the inside. Smoke still rose from the walls of Vane Castle when I knelt before the envoys of House Draven. The war had ended 3 days earlier, but for me it was only just beginning in that moment. My father, once the proud Lord of Vane, now hung as nothing more than a corpse over the castle gate, left there as a warning to anyone who still dared to resist. My brother stood beside me, hands bound, eyes red, but refusing to let himself weep aloud. The envoy read the treaty aloud over the cold wind sweeping through the ruins. House Vane was to surrender the last living Omega of its main bloodline as tribute and guarantee of the peace. I was that Omega. I did not cry. I had learned long ago that an Omega's tears only fed the satisfaction of others. I lifted my head and stared straight at the black wolf banner of House Draven flying over the ashes of my homeland and told myself, whatever it took, I would survive. Alaric arrived the following afternoon, not with a grand procession but with only a handful of trusted riders. Perhaps he needed no show of force, this entire land had already knelt to him. I stood in the ruined square, forced to wait like goods on display. When he dismounted and walked toward me, the alpha scent rolling off him was strong enough that I had to bite down hard to keep from stepping back. He stood a head taller than me, black hair cut close in the style of northern warriors. A long scar cutting across his left brow, a mark from some battle whose name I would never know. His gray eyes swept over me from head to toe, not the way one looks at someone they're meeting, but the way one inspects a spoil of war to see if it's still intact. "This is all that's left of Vane," he said. Not a question, I gave no answer. He didn't wait for one. He signaled to his men, and I was led onto a carriage bound north, toward the castle of the man who had killed my father. Draven Castle emerged through the evening mist, its gray stone walls looming like a beast waiting to swallow me whole. I was taken straight to the great hall, where the elders of House Draven had already gathered. No one asked my opinion. The bonding ceremony was no proposal, it was a clause in the treaty, carried out that very night under torchlight and chanting in an old tongue I couldn't understand. When Alaric drew close, his alpha scent surged violently, no longer the controlled presence of daylight but a pressure that flooded the entire room. My knees buckled without my wanting them to, my body betraying my mind under an Omega instinct I hated from the depths of my soul. I tried to keep my eyes open, tried to memorize the face of the man taking the last thing that belonged to me, but darkness swallowed me before the ceremony ended. The last thing I felt was hot breath against the back of my neck and pain tearing through my wrist like fire. I woke in an unfamiliar room, pale sunlight slanting through a narrow stone window. For a moment I thought I was still in Vane, until the pain in my wrist pulled me back to reality. I looked down. A dark bond mark shaped like a wolf's claw had carved itself into my skin, impossible to hide, impossible to erase. It was living proof that I no longer belonged to myself. The room was larger than any I had ever lived in, decorated lavishly in the northern style, but to me it was nothing more than a gilded cage. I walked to the window, looked down at the courtyard where Draven's soldiers trained, and understood that I was too far from home to escape on foot. I gripped my bonded wrist, and for the first time since my father's death, I let myself cry just once, only in this room where no one could see. The next morning, a servant entered my room, bowing and calling me my lady in a tone polite to the point of falseness. Her eyes said something else entirely, cold contempt for a prisoner of war dressed up in a noble title. I let her dress me in silence, listening to the servants whispering in the hallway. They spoke of me the way one speaks of a strange animal newly captured, tribute from a defeated land, carrier of the blood of an extinguished house. No one here saw me as a person. To them, I was only proof of Alaric's victory, a war ornament given a beautiful name to mask what I truly was. I looked at myself in the mirror, the lavish gown, the bond mark hidden beneath a long sleeve, and understood. If they wanted to see me as a trophy, I would let them. A well-behaved trophy is never suspected. And that was exactly what I needed, so that one day I could turn into the most dangerous weapon inside these very walls. I waited 3 weeks, watching every change of the guard, every path through the castle that saw little traffic. When the chance came on a night of heavy rain, I didn't hesitate. I slipped out of my room, wove through the dark garden, and headed straight for the eastern side gate. I was almost within reach of freedom when the darkness ahead turned into a living wall. Alaric stood blocking the gate, as if he'd known I would come this way, as if the entire escape had only ever been a game he allowed me to play. "Did you think I wasn't watching your every step?" he said, his voice cold without a trace of anger, which was somehow more frightening than rage would have been. He pulled me close, and before I could react, a thick wave of alpha pheromone tore through me like a burning blade, carving itself deeper into the bond mark on my wrist. I collapsed, my whole body shaking, feeling as though my very soul had just been stamped with ownership all over again. That was his punishment. No whip, no chains, just a trace of scent was enough to remind me who I belonged to. 3 days later, I was led out to the square in front of the castle, where servants and soldiers alike had already gathered. I didn't understand what was happening until I saw my brother being marched into the courtyard, hands bound behind his back. He was the last hope I had left. I believed that if I stayed obedient long enough, Alaric might one day show him mercy. But when Alaric stepped up onto the high platform, his eyes found mine before they found my brother's, and I understood at once this wasn't a trial. It was a performance meant for me alone. "Those who conspire to flee will pay the price," Alaric announced, his voice carrying across the square. "As will those who dare help them." I lunged forward, but the guards held me fast. I screamed my brother's name, but my voice drowned beneath the execution drums. The blade fell in less than a second, but that moment stretched on forever in my mind. I couldn't cry. Some pains go beyond tears. I simply stood there, watching the last drop of vein blood fall onto the cold stone, and felt something inside me shatter, not my heart, but the last remaining piece of my humanity. After that day, I learned a lesson I would never forget. Tears and resistance only brought death to the people I loved. If I wanted to survive, I had to become someone else entirely. I began practicing every expression in front of a mirror: the submissive smile, the eyes lowered at just the right moment, the soft voice with no trace of defiance in it. Every morning I put on the mask of an obedient Omega, and every night I peeled it off in the dark, left alone to face a hatred I could never speak aloud. Servants began looking at me differently, no longer with contempt, but with a strange mix of surprise and suspicion. Even Alaric's attitude began to shift. The punishments with pheromone grew rarer, replaced instead by a curious, watchful look whenever he glanced my way. I let him believe he had tamed a wild animal. No one knew that beneath that obedient mask, I was waiting for an opportunity, waiting for a weapon, waiting for the day I could return everything he had taken from me. A year had passed since I first walked into this castle. I had grown used to the rhythm of life here, used to facing Alaric every day without letting my hatred show, until I noticed something that terrified me. It happened on a late afternoon, when Alaric stepped into the reading room where I sat, backing me into a corner mid-argument over something trivial. The distance between us closed until I could feel his breath, and my body reacted in a way that had nothing to do with the script I had rehearsed. My heart raced, my breath quickened, a burning warmth spread through me that I couldn't explain away as fear. Alaric stopped, his eyes darkening as he caught the shift in my scent. He said nothing, only stepped back, but that moment was enough for me to understand a frightening truth. My Omega body, no matter how much my mind hated him, was slowly adapting to the bond carved into me. I returned to my room that night, wondering whether instinct might be the most dangerous enemy I had to fight, more dangerous even than Alaric himself. It was in that unsettled period that I met Alara, an elderly Omega who worked in the castle kitchens. someone no one paid attention to beyond how well she cooked and how little she spoke. She came to me one rainy night, set a warm cup of tea in front of me, and asked a question that startled me. "Do you know an Omega's pheromone isn't only meant for submission, it can become a weapon?" I stared at her, hardly able to believe my ears. Alara told me she had once been a spy serving a house destroyed by Draven years earlier, and in those years she had learned to control her own pheromone to manipulate her enemies instead of simply enduring as a victim. "I see in you what I once had," she said, her eyes both pitying and resolute. "But you must learn to control it, or it will destroy you before you ever get the chance to use it against anyone else." That night, by the flicker of a candle in the empty kitchen, my first lesson began, not a lesson in submission, but a lesson in how to turn the very thing that bound me into the sharpest weapon I would ever hold. From that night on, I found every excuse to visit the kitchens, bringing Alara tea, helping her prepare meals, small tasks unremarkable enough to avoid suspicion. But behind closed doors, every spare moment I had went into practicing pheromone control exactly as she taught me. It wasn't easy. An Omega's pheromone was built to respond by instinct, not by will. I had to learn to feel every current of emotion in my body, hold it back, then release it in precise doses at precise moments, like relearning how to breathe according to a rhythm entirely foreign to me. Many nights I couldn't sleep, lying in bed practicing control over my breath, over my own scent, until exhaustion took me. Some mornings I had to use powder to hide the shadows under my eyes, smiling at the servants as though nothing was wrong. No one in this castle knew that while they slept soundly, I was quietly forging the only weapon a prisoner like me could ever possess. The opportunity came one afternoon when I passed through the Great Hall and crossed paths with Alaric in the middle of a meeting with his generals. His eyes swept over me out of habit, checking, evaluating, as he always did. My heart raced, but not from fear this time. I took a deep breath and did exactly as Alara had taught me, not reacting on instinct, but deliberately releasing a carefully measured trace of pheromone, blending submission with something faintly inviting. Alaric faltered mid-sentence with the general beside him. Just a second, perhaps less than a second, but I saw it clearly. His eyes lost focus, his breath caught, before he regained his usual composure. The general beside him noticed nothing unusual, but I did. I bowed properly and walked away, keeping my expression perfectly calm, while my heart pounded with an entirely new feeling, the feeling of power. That night I didn't practice. I simply sat by the window, staring out at the darkness swallowing Draven Castle, letting the truth I'd just discovered sink deep into my mind. For a whole year, I had wondered how a prisoner with no blade in hand, no allies, no power, could ever avenge a house that had been wiped from existence. The answer had been inside me all along, the very thing Alaric had forced onto my body. The bond he thought was a chain was in fact the path straight to his weakness. If swords couldn't reach him, if armies couldn't defeat him, then my pheromone, the thing he saw as an Omega's lowly instinct, would be the one thing that could slip past every layer of his defenses, slowly eating away at his reason from within. I clenched my fist, looking down at the bond mark on my wrist under the pale moonlight. If he wanted to make me his possession, I would let him, but I would turn that very possession into the thing that killed him. 3 weeks later, disaster struck without warning. I was summoned to the Great Hall early one morning, where Alaric stood before a familiar figure bound tightly between two soldiers. Alara. Someone had found secret notes in her room, pages recording the theory of pheromone control that she had used to teach me. Alaric stood there, his eyes cold as they fell on her, then flicked toward me for a moment long enough to stop my heart. "A spy of Vane still lives within my own castle," he declared. "Let this be a lesson to anyone still harboring illusions of rebellion." I stood frozen, careful not to let any emotion show, while Alara's eyes found mine one last time. She showed no fear. She only smiled faintly and mouthed 3 final words without a sound. "Live, avenge us." The blade fell. I did not look away. I owed her at least the full weight of witnessing the price she paid for me, to carve it into my mind as a vow I would never forget. That night, I knelt before Alaric in his private chamber, head bowed low, my voice trembling just enough to sound like an omega shattered by the execution she had just witnessed. "Forgive me, my lord," I whispered. "I didn't know she was a spy, I only thought she was kind to me." Alaric studied me for a long time, his gray eyes searching for a lie. But all he saw was a trembling, submissive, entirely harmless omega, exactly what I wanted him to see. "Stand up," he finally said, his voice softening. "You bear no guilt." I stood, bowed in thanks, and quietly left his chamber. But inside me, another door had closed forever. I'd had a chance to escape that very night, could have used his carelessness to run as far as I could, but I would not. Alara had died for me. My brother had died for me. All of House Vane had fallen, and running would bring none of them back, would never repay this debt of blood. I would stay not as a prisoner resigned to her fate, but as a smoldering flame waiting for the day it would burn down everything Alaric had built, starting from inside his own heart. I began my campaign slowly, cautiously, like someone walking a tightrope over a chasm. Every time Alaric passed me in the corridor, I released a trace of carefully measured pheromone, not enough to draw attention, only enough to leave a faint impression lingering in his subconscious. At first I couldn't tell if it was working. Alaric kept his usual cold demeanor, still gave orders in the voice of a conqueror. But I began to notice small details. He stood near me longer than necessary at dinner. His eyes lingered on me longer than before. I came to understand that pheromone didn't work like an instant drug, but like an addiction built slowly, seeping into every corner of the mind of whoever breathed it in. Each day that passed, I felt myself one step closer to the plan Alara had handed me with her own life. I watched him eat dinner in silence that night, and for the first time since walking into this castle, I felt like I was no longer prey. 3 weeks later, I realized my plan was working in ways I hadn't quite expected. Alaric began coming to my room more often, no longer under the pretense of business or inspection, but simply appearing, sitting down, and staying longer than he needed to. Some nights he came late, after finishing his court duties, only to sit in silence in my room, as if my presence gave him something he couldn't find anywhere else in this vast castle. I learned to welcome those visits with a gentle exterior, pouring him tea, listening to the stories of battle he told, all while quietly maintaining a soft current of pheromone, enough to make him comfortable, enough to make him want to return. "You come so late." I asked him one night, my voice light, teasing. "Aren't you afraid the generals will talk?" Alaric only shrugged, his eyes holding an ease I'd never seen in him before. "I am the Lord of House Draven, where I choose to be is my own right." I bowed my head to hide a smile, but inside, I knew exactly what was happening. He no longer came for power. He came because he needed me. The more I practiced, the more I understood that my pheromone wasn't a simple tool with a single effect. It was like a complex map, where every emotion I felt produced a different scent, and each scent affected Alaric in its own distinct way. When I let real fear show through in moments when he stood too close, his gaze too sharp, the pheromone that rose from me made him more protective, his voice softening, sometimes even reaching to touch me as if to reassure. When I stirred up a false spark of desire, he grew unsteady, his breath quickening, his reason visibly slipping. But the most frightening discovery came when I experimented with suppressed anger just once, when he mentioned my father's death as though it were simply inevitable. The pheromone that rose from me that time carried a sharp, almost toxic edge, and Alaric suddenly grew irritable for no reason, snapping at a servant over some small mistake right after. I committed it all to memory, building an invisible map of how to steer the mind of the man who had stolen everything from me, not with sword or blade, but with the very thing he believed was an Omega's weak instinct. Not everyone in the castle was so easily swayed by my pheromone. Brennan, Alaric's most trusted general, the man who had stood beside him through countless battles, began looking at me differently, though I couldn't say exactly when it started. I first noticed the shift in his attitude during a military council meeting when I brought tea into the room out of habit. While no one else was paying attention, Brennan's eyes lingered on me a second too long, sharp and full of suspicion. After that, I began noticing him appearing in places I didn't expect in hallways I frequently walked, near the kitchen where I used to meet Alaric, even outside my window on late nights. He never said anything, never asked any questions, but his quiet presence felt like a cold shadow running down my spine every time I thought of him. I understood that Brennan was the one person left in this castle who still kept his wits about him against what I was doing. And a clear-headed man, absolutely loyal to Alaric, was the single greatest threat to my entire plan. I decided I had to act before Brennan found any concrete evidence. The chance came one afternoon when I deliberately walked past the training grounds where Brennan stood supervising the soldiers. I pretended to stumble nearby, letting a handkerchief fall to the ground. Then as I bent to pick it up, I let tears begin to fall, not real tears, but ones I had practiced to perfection over the past year. "Forgive me," I said, my voice shaking. "I just miss home so much." Brennan approached, his expression still holding its familiar wariness, but when he saw me crying, something in his eyes softened. I continued, speaking of loneliness, of feeling lost in an unfamiliar place, of simply trying to survive day by day, all of it true, only exaggerated many times over to convince him I was nothing more than a weak Omega, incapable of plotting anything at all. "I'm sorry for doubting you," Brennan finally said, a note of guilt in his voice. "You're only a victim of this war like so many others." I bowed my head in thanks, hiding the cold look behind wet lashes. Brennan had lowered his guard, at least for now, and that was exactly the window of time I needed to continue my plan undetected. I knew I couldn't topple an entire empire alone, no matter how powerful my pheromone became. I needed allies, even if they were only the smallest, quietest pieces within Alaric's machine of power. The first person I set my sights on was Mira, a young Omega servant who usually worked in the kitchen. I noticed that whenever family came up, a suppressed pain always flickered across her eyes. Her parents had been killed years earlier in a small purge Alaric ordered, based on nothing but false suspicion. I began speaking with her more often, sharing carefully chosen stories about Vane, about everything I had lost, gently leading her to open up about her own buried resentment. I didn't need to convince her of anything, I only needed to plant one simple, dangerous question in her mind. "If you had the chance, wouldn't you want to see justice done?" Mira didn't answer right away, but her eyes said everything. I smiled, knowing the first seed had been planted in the most fertile soil of all the quiet resentment simmering among those who served under Alaric. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice a clear change in Alaric's temperament. He grew more short-tempered, quicker to anger over trivial matters he would once have dismissed without a second thought. One morning, he shouted at a soldier for dropping a shield during training. One afternoon, he dismissed a longtime steward simply because a dish hadn't been prepared to his liking. Generals began whispering behind his back, wondering what was happening to the Lord once known for his calm, decisive nature. I knew exactly the cause. My pheromone, no matter how carefully I measured it, still left side effects I hadn't fully mastered controlling. The constant exposure to doses blended from complex emotions was slowly wearing away his natural ability to regulate his own feelings. I stood in the shadows, watching the slow collapse begin to take shape, and felt a satisfaction that unsettled even me. This was only the beginning, and he still didn't realize his most dangerous enemy was living right inside his own bedroom. The next opportunity came at a banquet hosting neighboring lords, when I saw Alaric speaking intimately with a beautiful Omega from an allied house. It was nothing more than ordinary social conversation, but I realized this was the perfect opening to accelerate my plan. I stood at a distance, letting my eyes follow them with a carefully calculated look of hurt, then quietly left the great hall before the banquet ended. I knew Alaric would notice my absence. He always noticed, no matter how much he tried to hide it. Sure enough, less than half an hour later, he came to my room, his face a mix of confusion and something that looked like worry. "Why did you leave early?" I turned away, letting my voice shake slightly. "You don't owe me any explanation. You're the Lord. Who you choose to speak with is your own right." "You're jealous," he said, not a question but a discovery, almost delighted. I stayed silent, letting the silence itself become the answer. And in that moment, I saw exactly what I needed to see: a strange light in Alaric's eyes, as though he had just received the final proof that I truly belonged to him, body and heart both. That night, Alaric stayed in my room longer than usual. He sat at the edge of the bed, looking at me with a tenderness I had never seen in him before, a tenderness that made me feel nauseous more than moved. I never thought I'd say this to anyone. He began, his voice low, so unlike the commanding tone I knew. "But since the day you walked into this castle, everything has changed. I'm not who I used to be." I stayed silent, waiting. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he said, his gray eyes staring straight into mine with a sincerity that nearly broke my composure. Isn't that absurd? The man who stole everything from you, now kneeling before his own feelings. I looked at him, the man who had hanged my father, beheaded my brother, executed the one woman who had ever shown me kindness in this past year, now sitting here, whispering words of love like an entirely different person. I smiled at him, a gentle, shy smile, exactly what an Omega being loved was supposed to show. I reached out and touched his cheek lightly, letting him believe this moment meant as much to me as it did to him. "So am I," I whispered, my voice sounding so genuine that even I was startled by my own capacity for deception. Alaric closed his eyes, leaning his head into my hand like a child seeking comfort, completely unaware that the man he had just given his heart to was quietly counting down the days until she could tear it apart. After he left, I sat alone in the dark, pulling the blanket up around myself. My hand gripped the fabric so tightly my knuckles turned white, while my face remained perfectly calm. I thought of my father, my brother, Alara, everyone who had fallen because of the very man who had just spoken words of love to me tonight. Whatever warmth might have remained in my heart was now completely frozen. And in that cold, I found the strongest resolve I had ever felt. I would let him love me completely, only so that one day, that love would become the weapon that finally destroyed him. I had always been careful to hide my notes on pheromone pages. I had begun writing myself after Alara's death, recording every reaction, every dose I had tested on Alaric. But my caution wasn't enough. One afternoon, returning to my room after a tea gathering with the other ladies, I found the cabinet door slightly out of place from where it usually sat. My heart clenched. Someone had entered my room while I was away. That night, I overheard two guards talking in the hallway, mentioning that Brennan had ordered a search of my room on his own authority without going through Alaric. My blood ran cold. If he found those notes, everything I had built over the past year would collapse in an instant, and this time, the price might be my own life. I had no time to panic. The moment night fell, I slipped back to my room, pulled every page of notes from beneath the floorboard where I'd hidden them, and burned them all in the fireplace before Brennan could return to search again. But fire couldn't erase the trail already left behind. I knew Brennan had seen at least a fragment before I managed to destroy the rest. I needed a scapegoat, someone to redirect his suspicion away from me before he reported to Alaric. I remembered a young slave named Torin, who had once been caught secretly reading in the library without permission, a small slip, but enough to build a story around. That night, I quietly planted a half-burned scrap of paper, scrawled with a few lines in handwriting meant to imitate someone else's, into the corner of Torin's quarters while he worked below in the kitchen. The next morning, when the guards discovered the evidence, I stood silent in the crowd, my heart pounding not from fear for myself, but from the knowledge that I had just pushed an innocent life toward death. Torin was dragged out into the courtyard, his young face pale with terror, pleading over and over that he hadn't written those lines, that he knew nothing about pheromone or any conspiracy. But no one believed the word of a slave, especially with evidence sitting plainly in his room. Alaric stood on the high platform and ordered the execution carried out immediately, to warn anyone else who might think of spying within the castle. I stood among the crowd of onlookers, alongside the other ladies and servants, keeping my expression as calm as it had been every time before. The blade fell. Torrhen's final cry echoed through the courtyard and then fell silent. I didn't look away, didn't let any emotion show, though something inside me was screaming. This was the first time I had directly caused the death of an innocent person, not an enemy. Not someone who had harmed my family, just a boy who had, by pure chance, become a sacrifice for my own survival. That night, I lay in bed, waiting for the tears of remorse I expected to come as they always had. They didn't come. I only felt a strange emptiness, as if the part of me that once ached at another person's death was slowly going numb. I remembered myself from a year ago, the Omega who once wept bitterly at watching a servant punished unfairly, who once ached with guilt over a single harmless lie. That person was gone now, replaced by someone who could push an innocent life toward death without so much as a flinch. I wondered if Alara would still recognize me, if she could see what I had become. Whether this was simply the inevitable price of revenge, or whether I was slowly turning into the very same kind of monster as the man I hated. But even after questioning myself to the point of exhaustion, I still couldn't stop. My father, my brother, Alara, they deserved to be avenged, no matter how many other innocent lives had to fall along the way. I closed my eyes, let the darkness swallow the guilt gnawing at me, and kept moving forward. A week after the incident, Alaric summoned the entire court into the Great Hall and announced a decision that shook the room. He would officially name me Lady of House Draven, no longer a war tribute, but the head of his household, standing equal to his own rank. Whispers rippled through the hall. Many nobles and generals wore open displeasure. How could a prisoner of war, carrying the blood of a defeated house, be raised to such a noble position? I knelt before Alaric, bowing in thanks according to proper ritual, while my eyes flicked toward the disapproving faces behind me. I understood immediately this divide was exactly the opening I needed. A unified court would be difficult to shake, but a court already fractured by this very announcement would collapse far more easily once I pushed my plan forward. "Thank you, my lord," I said, my voice soft, while my mind was already mapping out the next step, using the very discontent brewing here to sow even more seeds of rebellion within House Draven. The divide within the court, following my elevation, was exactly the door I needed. I began watching for the faces that had shown the clearest displeasure during that ceremony, a group of old-blood Draven nobles who believed their standing was threatened by the rise of an outsider like me. I approached them indirectly, through Mira, who had by now become my loyal ears and eyes inside the castle. Small pieces of information passed through channels no one would ever suspect. A whisper during laundry, a rumor told at just the right moment, to just the right person. I never met the opposing faction directly. I simply let them believe there was a mysterious ally within the household, someone who understood their grievances and was willing to support them from the shadows. They didn't know who I was, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that the seed of discontent now had soil to take root and grow into something far larger. 3 weeks later, Mira brought me news that made my heart race. The opposing faction, emboldened by the quiet encouragement I had sown, was planning to assassinate Alaric at the upcoming temple ceremony, when he would stand alone on the high platform before the entire court. I sat in silence for a long time after hearing it, weighing every option. I could warn Alaric, stop the plot, strengthen his trust in me, or I could stay silent, let fate decide the fate of the man who had destroyed my house. But I knew better than anyone, if Alaric died right now, that death would be too quick, too easy compared to what he deserved. I wanted him to tear down everything he had built with his own hands, to live long enough to realize he himself had created the one who would destroy him. Death by a blade in the dark would never be enough. I chose silence not because I wanted him dead, but because I needed him alive, at least until I had completed my plan entirely. The temple ceremony took place beneath a gray, overcast sky. I stood among the ladies and nobles, my heart pounding as I watched Alaric step onto the high platform, completely unaware of the blade waiting in the shadows. The assassin struck fast as lightning, an arrow fired from the crowd, aimed straight at Alaric's chest. But a loyal bodyguard, reflexes honed by years of war, shoved him aside just in time. The arrow only grazed his shoulder, leaving a wound that wasn't life-threatening. The entire square erupted into chaos. Guards immediately hunted for the archer while Alaric was rushed inside, his face pale more from shock than from pain. When his eyes found me through the panicked crowd, I saw something new in them, something unsettling, not concern for me, but a searching, suspicious look, as though for the first time he was wondering whether I had known something in advance. That night, I was summoned to Alaric's private chamber, where he sat with his wound freshly bandaged, his eyes still carrying the shadow of unresolved suspicion. The air in the room was heavy enough that I could feel my own heartbeat pounding. "You know anything about this?" he asked directly, his voice cold as it had been the first days I arrived here. I knew this was the deciding moment. If I didn't handle it carefully, everything I had built over the past year could collapse in an instant. I knelt before him, letting tears fall, my voice trembling with a panic that was both real and rehearsed. "You doubt me," I whispered, "after everything I've given you." And then I let my pheromone surge at the strongest dose I had ever dared to use, a complex blend of hurt, absolute loyalty, and a hint of longing to be protected. I felt that current of energy flood the room, sinking deep into every one of Alaric's senses. I watched the suspicion in Alaric's eyes slowly dissolve, replaced by a visible guilt. He stood up, stepped toward me, and wrapped his arms around me clumsily, so unlike the dignified composure he always showed to others. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my ear, his voice trembling in a way strange for a man who had just escaped death. "I shouldn't have doubted you. I was afraid of losing you." I stayed silent in his arms, feeling his heart pounding hard against my chest. "I can't live without you," he went on, his voice breaking as though even he was startled by his own weakness. "When did I become like this?" I wrapped my arms around his back, pressing my face into his shoulder to hide the utter coldness in my eyes. In that darkness, I smiled, not the smile of love, but the smile of a predator watching its prey walk willingly into the final steps of a trap. Alaric, the once unbeatable lord, had now become fully dependent on me, not only in body but in soul. And that was exactly what I needed to begin the final stage of my plan for revenge. The failed assassination left a deep psychological scar on Alaric, though he tried to hide it beneath his usual calm exterior. Just days later, he began ordering security tightened throughout the castle, not only against strangers, but against the very people who had served him for years. Every military meeting now had an additional watcher standing behind the generals. Letters coming in and out of the castle were inspected more thoroughly. Even meals now had to pass through a taster before being served to him. I watched it all from my position as his lady, quietly satisfied at what was unfolding. Fear and suspicion, once rooted in the mind of a powerful man, spread on their own like a disease that needed no further intervention from me. I only had to stand and watch, and sometimes gently add a drop of oil to the fire of doubt already burning. 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, Alaric summoned the court to announce a decision that shocked everyone. Brennan, the general who had served him loyally for years, the man who had saved his life no fewer than 3 times on the battlefield, was stripped of his command over the personal guard. "You failed to protect me at the temple ceremony," Alaric declared before the entire court, his voice cold without hesitation. "Such a failure cannot be forgiven." The great hall fell into heavy silence. Everyone knew it was the bodyguard, not Brennan, who had pushed Alaric out of the arrow's path. But no one dared speak against the decision of a lord growing more paranoid by the day. I stood beside Alaric, watching Brennan's face harden with suppressed humiliation and fury. That was exactly the reaction I needed to see a man once absolutely loyal, now beginning to taste the bitterness of injustice from the very man he had once risked his life to protect. I sought out Brennan on a moonless night when he was alone practicing his sword work in the empty back courtyard. I knew this was a great gamble if Brennan still held even a trace of loyalty to Alaric. This meeting could be the end of me. You shouldn't be here alone. Brennan said when he saw me, his voice still wary, though softer than before. I know you don't trust me, I said directly without dancing around it. But I think you deserve to know the truth. The one who protested your removal most strongly was me, though no one listens to the words of an outsider lady. A flicker of surprise crossed Brennan's eyes. I continued, choosing each word carefully, revealing just enough truth to plant doubt without exposing my entire plan. I don't understand how a lord once so wise could treat his most loyal man so unjustly. Perhaps power is changing him in ways no one expected. I walked away, leaving Brennan standing alone in the darkness, his face full of turmoil I knew would soon grow into something far more dangerous. In the weeks that followed, I began to hear whispers spreading through every hidden corner of the castle, among the soldiers, among the servants, even in the private meetings of the nobility. People began calling what was happening to Alaric the pheromone curse. A rumor that the once unbeatable lord was slowly being manipulated by something no ordinary reasoning could explain. No one dared say outright that the source of that curse was me, but the searching looks some of them gave me whenever I passed said enough. I pretended not to notice, continuing to play the gentle, obedient lady, while inside the castle, suspicion and unease spread quietly like an incurable plague. I understood that these rumors, dangerous as they were also a necessary part of my plan. An empire doesn't fall from a single blow, it falls when the people inside it begin to doubt one another. When the trust that once held everything together begins to crack from its smallest fractures. I realized the extent of Alaric's dependence on me had gone far beyond anything I'd imagined, when one morning he summoned me into his study in the middle of a policy discussion with his advisors. "What do you think of this?" He asked me in front of everyone, pointing to a strategic map concerning the southern border. The advisors exchanged looks of shock and displeasure. Never before had a lady been asked for her opinion on serious military matters. But Alaric seemed to no longer care about their reactions, waiting only for my answer as though the final decision depended entirely on what I said. I realized, with a feeling both satisfying and unsettling, that Alaric could now barely make any important decision without my presence beside him. The lord who had once conquered a vast stretch of land had become a puppet in the hands of the very person he once saw as his war trophy. One rainy night, as I walked in the garden behind the castle, a habit I kept for the sake of private thought, a stranger's shadow slipped quietly out from behind the bushes, startling me back a step. "Don't be afraid, my lady." The figure whispered, his voice carrying the familiar accent of my homeland. "I am an envoy from what remains of House Vane, sent to find a way to save the last heir." My heart clenched at the mention of my house's name. The man explained that a small group of Vane loyalists had survived the war, hiding along a distant border, and had made a secret plan to smuggle me out of Draven Castle that very night. I stood frozen, looking into the hopeful eyes of the envoy, the representative of my last chance to return to freedom, to leave behind the place that had taken everything from me. "I won't go," I said, my voice steadier than I thought I could manage. The envoy looked at me in disbelief, perhaps assuming fear or manipulation had driven me to refuse the chance to escape. "My lady, this may be the only chance. I don't need to escape," I cut in. "I need something else. If you truly want to help House Vane get its revenge, help me reach the other houses who still hold resentment toward Alaric, those who lost family, lost land under his hand. Don't take me away. Help me build a network." The envoy stayed quiet for a long moment, then finally nodded, a new respect showing in his eyes. "I will carry your words to those who still hold hatred for House Draven." He vanished into the dark as quickly as he had appeared, leaving me standing alone in the garden, my heart racing, having just laid the first stone of an alliance that would change everything. Over the following months, through the secret network established by that envoy, I began connecting with other small houses that had suffered under House Draven's oppression, lords who had lost sons in the war, houses stripped of their land. People carrying a quiet resentment that had simmered for years. I never appeared directly, always keeping myself hidden behind the mask of Alaric's obedient lady. Every contact was made through intermediaries, through codes hidden in letters that seemed harmless, through Mira and the network of loyal servants I had painstakingly built. Piece by piece, everything began to connect. Brennan's growing discontent, the outside houses hungry for revenge, internal generals beginning to doubt their own lord. I stood at the center of it all, like a spider quietly weaving a web that would soon envelop and tighten around the Draven Empire from every side. But a network this large couldn't avoid every crack. One morning, shocking news spread through the castle. Guards had captured a secret messenger carrying a coded letter, revealing part of the plot against Alaric. He flew into a fury, summoning the entire court into the great hall, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights and suspicion built up over months. "There is a traitor within this very castle," he roared, his voice filling the vast room. "I will find every one of them, even if I have to search every corner." I stood among the crowd, keeping a worried expression fitting the role of a loyal lady, while inside my heart pounded. The network I had built stood on the edge of exposure, and if that happened, not only would my plan collapse, but the lives of the many innocent people who had trusted me would be at risk too. In the depths of his paranoia, Alaric ordered a purge without mercy. Anyone with even a hint of suspicious connection, anyone who had shown a moment of discontent, was arrested and interrogated. I watched from a distance as one person after another was dragged from their quarters, among them many generals who had served House Draven loyally for decades, people who had no connection at all to the secret network I had built. Alaric's paranoia had gone far beyond reason, turning what should have been a search for the true traitor into a meaningless slaughter. Cries of grief, pleas of innocence echoed through the castle halls for days on end. I stayed silent, never intervening, though I knew full well that most of the people dying were nothing more than innocent victims of the very suspicion I had planted. Watching the scene unfold, I wondered would I had become a warrior avenging a lost house, or a murderer disguised as a victim, willing to sacrifice anyone at all to reach my final goal. But that question, like so many times before, wasn't strong enough to make me stop. The purge lasted an entire week, and throughout it, I stood beside Alaric every time he appeared in public, my hand clasped in his, my face perfectly calm, as though I fully believed in the justice he claimed to be carrying out. Inside, every cry of innocence, every drop of blood spilled onto the castle stone carved itself deeper into my mind, but I had learned to separate myself from those feelings, locking them away in some deep corner so I could keep playing the role of a loyal, wholly supportive lady. The surviving nobles and generals began looking at me differently, no longer with the suspicion or contempt of before, but with a fear mixed with respect, as though they realized the one standing beside their lord held power even greater than they could imagine. On the final night of the purge, once things had settled, Alaric came to my room in a state I had never seen before, his hands trembling, his gray eyes, once always cold, now full of confusion. "I don't know what I'm becoming," he whispered, sinking down beside the bed, his head falling into his hands. "I killed the very people who once risked their lives for me, all because of a fear I can't control." I sat down beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder with a carefully measured tenderness. Alaric looked up at me, and in that moment, I saw something astonishing, not fear over his crumbling power, but pure fear of losing me. "If I lose you," he said, his voice shaking like a child's, "I don't know what I'd have left." I held him, letting him rest his head against my chest, while my mind coldly registered. The lord who had once made an entire land tremble had now completely collapsed before the fear of losing the very weapon destroying him day by day. 3 days later, Mira slipped a small note into my sleeve, Brennan's familiar handwriting appearing clearly by candlelight. "The army is ready." The allied houses have gathered at the western border, awaiting only your signal, my lady." I read the line over and over, feeling my heart race with a mix of excitement and fear. After months of quiet work, after so many lives lost along this path, the final decisive moment had arrived. Brennan, once a loyal general betrayed, had now become the leader of an alliance strong enough to topple an entire empire. I burned the note in the candle flame, watching it turn to ash, and knew I had only one final task left, choosing the right moment to open the gate for the rebel army to enter. On the night the rebel army was set to enter the city, I made sure Alaric stayed by my side, away from the generals and the defenses he had painstakingly built over the months. I invited him to a private dinner in my room, poured him wine, told him gentle stories of an imagined future where the two of us could live in peace, free of war or suspicion. And throughout that meal, I released the strongest dose of pheromone I had ever dared to use, a carefully blended mix of longing, false safety, and a deep, sinking daze. Alaric slowly slipped into a hazy state, his reason dimming to the point where he no longer registered any of the unusual sounds drifting in from outside, the pounding of hooves, distant shouts drawing nearer by the minute. "Stay here with me tonight," I whispered, my voice sweet as honey, while outside, the western gate I had secretly ordered left lightly guarded open to let Brennan's army pour in. The first scream rang out from somewhere distant, then quickly spread throughout the castle like an unstoppable tidal wave. Alaric startled out of his hazy state, but it was already too late. The rebel army had breached the walls, fire beginning to blaze from the western watchtowers. He bolted from the room, shouting orders. But the defense system he had once been so proud of had already crumbled from the very suspicion he had sown for months, generals no longer trusting one another, soldiers confused about whose orders to follow amid the chaos. I stood by the window, watching flames dance across the towers that had once symbolized House Draven's untouchable power, listening to the screams of loyal soldiers and rebel forces clashing throughout the streets of the city. The empire Alaric had spent so long building, the empire that had buried my entire house beneath its ashes, was now beginning to fall, not from an outside invasion, but from within, from the cracks I had quietly carved into every corner for more than 2 years. Alaric jolted awake to screaming echoing through the castle, bolting from bed still hazy from the last traces of pheromone. Through the window, he saw fire blazing from every direction, saw shadows scattering across the courtyard, saw the flash of steel clashing beneath the flames. But what stunned him most wasn't the enemy pouring in, it was the sight of his own soldiers turning on one another, familiar faces who had once fought at his side now staring at each other with suspicion and hatred. "What is happening?" he muttered, trying to piece together the fog still clouding his mind. In his rising panic, he realized this wasn't simply an outside attack. His own house was tearing itself apart from within, the consequence of months of suspicion and purges he himself had sown. Alaric ran toward my room, throwing the door open, his eyes full of panic as he found me standing silently by the window, watching the chaos below with a strange calm. "Are you safe?" he asked first, his whole body trembling with fear, his hand gripping my shoulder as though to make sure I was truly there. But then his eyes settled on my face, a face that carried none of the fear that should have been there before a castle burning in fire and blood. "Do you know what's happening?" he asked, his voice slowing, a flicker of doubt creeping into his panicked gray eyes. "Why are you so calm?" I looked at him, feeling the moment I had waited for over 2 years finally arrive, the moment every last mask would finally have to fall. "Because I know what's happening," I said, my voice calm to a degree that even surprised me. "Because everything happening out there was arranged by my own hand." Alaric stood frozen, his hand still resting on my shoulder though all its strength had drained away. What are you saying?" "The assassination last year, the suspicion slowly eating away at your reason. Brennan becoming the leader of the rebellion, the allied houses marching into the city tonight." I listed each one, my voice never wavering, my eyes never leaving his for even a moment. "All of it, from beginning to end, was me. I pulled back my sleeve, revealing the bond mark on my wrist beneath the firelight spilling through the window. You thought this was a chain binding me to you, but you were wrong. This was the path I used to walk straight into your heart and your reason, to destroy you from within, the way you destroyed my house. Alaric stumbled back a step as though struck through the chest by another blade. His gray eyes, once so cold, once so full of authority, now held only emptiness and utter shock. No, he shook his head, his voice breaking. It's not possible. You loved me. You told me you loved me. I never loved you, I answered, each word cutting deeper into the wound just opened. I only learned how to make you believe I did, long enough for you to tear down your own empire with your own hands. He sank to the floor, back against the wall, his hands, which had once commanded thousands of soldiers, now shaking uncontrollably. The man he had trusted most, the man he thought was the only light left in his blood-soaked life, was the very one who had quietly led him to the edge of ruin for over 2 years. I loved an illusion, he whispered, barely audible, an illusion you built with your own hands just to kill me. The sound of hurried footsteps rang out from the hallway, then the door burst open. Brennan appeared, his armor soaked in blood, a dozen soldiers of the Rebel Alliance behind him, weapons ready. The Great Hall has fallen. Brennan announced, his eyes sweeping over Alaric sitting motionless on the floor before settling on me with a mixture of respect and wariness. This castle now belongs to the Alliance. Alaric looked up, and in that moment, I saw something strange flicker in his eyes, not hatred for the traitor standing before him, but one last glance toward me, as though still searching for an explanation, a reason to believe this wasn't truly the end. Soldiers flooded into the room, surrounding us both between walls that had witnessed 2 years of deception and manipulation. I stood there, between the enemy I had destroyed and the ally I had created, realizing the final decisive moment of my entire plan had now nearly arrived. As the soldiers tightened their circle, something no one expected happened. Alaric rose to his feet, stepping forward, placing himself between me and the blades pointed our way. No one touches him. Alaric roared, his voice still carrying the last remnants of a lord's authority, even though only minutes earlier he had learned the most brutal truth of his life. Brennan froze, his eyes full of confusion he couldn't make sense of. Even I stood stunned, never expecting that after everything he had just heard, Alaric's first instinct would still be to protect me, using his own body as a shield against a dozen waiting blades. I looked at the broad back standing before me, feeling a strange emotion rise in my chest, not tenderness, but a deep confusion over a man far more complicated than I had ever truly understood. Why? I asked, my voice trembling for the first time since the truth had come out. Why do you still protect me after everything I just told you? Alaric didn't turn to look at me, his eyes still fixed on the soldiers surrounding us, his sword raised and ready even though he knew full well he had no chance of winning. Because it's an instinct I can't control, he answered, his voice low but steady. Just as you taught me that instinct can sometimes be stronger than reason. You used pheromone to make me depend on you, but perhaps, even without the pheromone, the deepest instinct in me would still choose to protect you. I stood silent, unable to find any words to answer. In that moment, the line between enemy and something else entirely, something I didn't dare name, blurred in a way that frightened me. Brennan signaled the soldiers forward, knowing there was no more time to hesitate. Alaric looked around the room, the great hall blazing in the distance through the window, the clash of steel echoing from every corner of the castle, the empire he had spent so many years building now collapsing before his eyes. For a moment, his gaze lingered on me, then he turned toward the largest support pillar holding up the vaulted ceiling above us. If this empire must fall, Alaric said, his voice strangely calm, as though he had just arrived at a decision he'd been waiting to make for a long time. I won't let it fall into anyone else's hands but my own. He swung his sword, putting all his remaining strength into striking the base of the stone pillar already weakened by fire. The stone cracked with a sound like the roar of a dying beast, and the ceiling above began to shudder violently. Go, Alaric turned to me, pushing me toward the door after Brennan and the soldiers had already hurried out at the sign of collapse. "This is the last thing I can do for you." "What about you?" I asked, my voice breaking despite myself. "This empire was built on the blood of your house," he said, his gray eyes looking at me one last time with a strange calm. "Perhaps it's only fair that it's buried with me." Before I could react, he shoved me hard out of the room, the door slamming shut behind me amid the roar of collapsing stone. I was pulled away by Brennan's soldiers, dragged far from the building as it caved in, only managing to glance back once as the entire main hall crashed down in a massive column of fire and dust, burying Alaric along with the empire he had once ruled. I stood in the square outside the castle, watching the flames devour what remained of the fortress that had held me captive for 3 years. Around me, soldiers of the Alliance cheered their victory, allied houses embracing each other in celebration of House Draven's fall. Brennan came to stand beside me, saying nothing, only silently following my gaze toward the fire. I knew I should feel relief, should feel the joy of a revenge finally completed, of freedom after so many years of waiting. But inside my chest, there was only an unnamed emptiness, a strange hollowness I couldn't put into words. I thought of Alaric's final look, of his words about an instinct he couldn't control, of how he had chosen to end things on his own terms rather than let me or anyone else decide his fate. I turned and walked away from the ruins, free for the first time in 3 years after living as someone's possession. But that freedom, it turned out, didn't taste as sweet as I had once imagined. It left only a quiet emptiness, a space that had once held both hatred and another feeling I would never allow myself to name. I have freedom, I have my revenge, an empire fallen at the feet of the man who once trampled my house into the ground. So why does my chest still hold only an unnamed emptiness? Perhaps there are some things revenge can never give back. Perhaps some bonds, even once broken, still stay carved into the heart forever. If you were in my place, would you choose forgiveness, or would you choose to watch him burn in the fire you lit with your own hands?